Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to class. So today we're going to be finishing up chapter 3. Before we get into the actual lecture, I would like you, if you are in BB Learn, you're going to want to get out of it and refresh it. But if you're not in it, you should start logging on to BB Learn right now. You're going to have the opportunity to take a little survey that is going to give you the option to put your first and second choices for days to attend. Now, this is only for people who plan to attend in person. Those of you who have applied and been approved to do remote, you do not need to do this. Is there a question? Okay, so go on to BB Learn, onto your homepage, scroll all the way to the bottom, and you should see a little survey called like attendance day or something. And then remember, your options are Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I want you to give me your first and second choices in that order, and then quickly submit. I will take them in the order in which I receive them. Some people are not going to get their first or second choice, but I will do my best. They've given me a maximum cap on the number of students I can have in the classroom at a time. Ashton, I think you're unmuted.
I have a question.
Sure.
So if we aren't attending that day in person, do we attend online still?
You do. So you're just gonna do it like you normally would. Sorry guys, for some reason, my chat box just disappeared. I know people are trying to chat with me. For some reason, it just disappeared. If you have submitted a request to be fully remote and that has been approved, that would have come from advisement, you will just log into this exact place every single day like we were still doing online classes. The difference will be, instead of me doing this from my home, I'll be doing it from a classroom at the College of Business. That's going to be the only difference, really. Everything else will be the same. You'll get the same opportunities. You'll be given the same worksheets, post them online and things like that, that you would get otherwise. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, of course.
Professor, sorry to ask the question again. Like, my Zoom was giving me some problems.
That's okay.
In.
That's
Where
okay.
are we submitting? What are we doing?
You mean if you're fully remote, or right now, what should you be doing? Sorry. Right now. So you should be logging on to BB Learn, go onto your homepage for this class and scroll down to the very bottom, and you should see a survey that says attendance day or something. And then you open that up and you put in your request for preferred day to attend the actual physical class. And so it's going to be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday are your choices. Give me your first and second choice. It's possible I might not be able to give you your first and second choice, but I want to try and accommodate as many students as possible.
Okay.
Yep.
That answers. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else?
What if in advising that they just told you just to work with your professor? Is that what I would just have to do?
Like if you want to be remote?
Yeah, that's what my advisor told me. He said to just work with your professors.
Okay, you didn't have to fill out an actual form?
Yeah, he didn't say I had to fill out an application.
What school are you from?
The College of Business too.
You are? Okay, well that's interesting. I haven't heard that yet. I totally believe that that's probably what they're doing at this point. It's fine. Don't go to the survey and don't put anything down unless you already have, but I wouldn't go. It's fine. Those of you who want to be remote, I've been approving all of those anyway, so yeah.
Okay, all right.
Everybody good?
When is the first in-person day?
So the first in-person day is Monday. So it's a week from today.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And your classroom will be on your syllabus, and your syllabus is on BB Learn. I'm in 3 different classrooms each day, so I can't remember exactly which one you guys are in, but you can find your room number if you look on the top of the syllabus on BB Learn. There will be, sorry, those of you who do come to class, there will be a seating chart, if you will, that the College of Business has come up with. When you walk in, I believe that seating chart will be displayed right inside the door, and it will show you exactly what seats you have the option of sitting in. Like, it's not like you specifically have to sit in a specific seat. What it's going to say is these are the seats students can sit in, and it's going to have a little map of seats, and you're going to have to sit in one of those seats. It provides for optimal social distancing. Make sure you bring a mask, and make sure you don't come if you're feeling any symptoms. Any questions about that? All right. All right, so let's start today. Well, you know what, before we start on chapter 3, a couple of things. Your chapter 3 homework is going to be due on Sunday. So after today, we will be done with chapter 3, and you can go ahead and start on that. The second thing is we are going to start on chapter 4 on Wednesday and continue it on Friday. Chapter 4 is pretty fundamental. And if you weren't very good in econ, if you are new to econ altogether, you're going to want to attend chapter 4 lectures. It's not that it's hard, and relative to other chapters in this class, it's not, but it's pretty important in terms of just getting some of the fundamental things down, some of those first graphs you're going to see. So I would caution you against feeling like you could skip the chapter 4 lectures, because that's not going to pan out very well for you. Okay. All right. So remember that chapter 3 is about economic decision makers. And so we started with the first tier economic decision makers with households. Got through that, then started with firms, which are on that second tier. That second tier is firms, government, rest of the world. So we started with firms, got mostly through firms. We're kind of doubling back to firms with this slide, and then we're going to go on to government and rest of the world to finish out the lecture. But we're sort of doubling back to households and firms with this slide right here when we talk about something we call household production. Household production, the reason we tuck it here after firms is because it explains sort of the connection between the goods and services that we demand and being households as the demanders of goods and services who sometimes decide to do stuff ourselves. So it sort of bridges the gap between households and firms. It's like sometimes households actually do their own production and they don't rely on firms for production. And that stuff is stuff we call household production. This is stuff you're going to do for yourself typically. Not always, but typically. So this is going to be cook your own food, wash your own clothes, run your own vacuum, mow your own lawn. That's all going to be stuff that typically falls under this category of household production. There are reasons we do production for ourselves, legitimate economic reasons, and I've listed them here and we'll go through them. But there are some households that don't. There are some households that don't mow their own lawn, some households that don't cook their own food, right? We'll talk about why those people are different, but it's sound economic reasons either way, no matter what choice we make. But let's talk about the reasons people do their own household production, okay? So the first thing, and this is kind of hard, it's kind of wordy, but I'll explain to you what this means. The first reason we do household production is because the opportunity cost is below market. So what that means is, if I see somebody out mowing their lawn, yeah, they might enjoy it. And that might be the reason they do it. But I think for most people, the reason they do it is because they've done an analysis about their time. When I say they've done an analysis about their time, what I mean is they've thought about how much it would cost them to have somebody do that for them. And let's say in the case of a lawn, it's 30, 40 bucks, something like that. What that person is saying is that the amount of time, 20, 30 minutes, however long it takes them to mow the lawn, isn't worth that amount of their own time isn't even worth $30 or $40. So when I see somebody who does their own laundry, who cooks their own food, who mows their own lawn, this is one of the first things that I can assume about them, is that that time that they're spending isn't worth, that physical time isn't worth what they would have paid for somebody else to do it. Now, again, we're talking about human behavior here, so, right, it's a little more complicated than that. But that's the first thing I think I can say about them, okay? There's a reason you do your own laundry, and a lot of times you cook your own food, and whatever, run your own vacuum, okay? It's because you've done that time assessment. The second thing is because usually with household production, no special skills or resources are required. Now, yeah, you need a vacuum in order to vacuum, and yeah, you need a washing machine in order to wash your own clothes, and those really are capital resources. And so to some extent, you do need some resources, but you definitely don't need any special skills or entrepreneurial ability, or here we're really talking about things like education and training. You don't need a lot of training to wash a dish. You don't need a lot of training to throw a load in the washing machine, sorry. You don't need a lot of special skills, right? You've probably been doing it for years. So that's another reason we do household production. It's a combination of these things, right? The other thing is we do avoid paying taxes when we do this kind of stuff ourselves. Fact is, if you go out to eat, you're paying someone to do the cooking for you, and you are going to have to pay taxes on that particular service. If you do it yourself, you don't have to pay any tax on it because you're doing it yourself, right? You weren't paying anybody. There wasn't a bill that they could add tax to. This next thing, reduced transaction costs, is interesting. Transaction costs by definition are the time and energy that you spend doing something, doing a transaction, doing a job, whatever. Transaction costs are specifically the time and energy it takes you to do something. And so you're like, how does it reduce transaction costs for me to do my own laundry instead of somebody else do my laundry? Well, I actually have a personal story on this. Probably 3 or 4 years ago, I decided I was done doing laundry. I hate it. I'm never going to do it again. And honestly, I was going to pay somebody else to do it. So I called around, found some places who would do it. I thought the price seemed pretty reasonable, and I was sold, right? And then I did it one time. And the transaction costs, honestly, were so high, I haven't done it since. So what were the transaction costs of me having somebody else do my laundry? Well, I had to gather it up, double check, make sure I have everything, haul it downstairs, load it into my vehicle, drive to the laundromat, unload it, stand in line, get up to the cashier, explain to them how I wanted my laundry sorted and done or whatever. Then I left, drove back home. Then 2 days later, I drove back, waited in line again, paid for it, hauled it all out to my car, drove home, hauled it all. By the time I was done with the time and energy part, that cost was, the money was nothing compared to the transaction costs. So now I just do my laundry at home, right? Because the transaction costs were way too high. We reduce that by doing it ourselves because we can do it on our own schedule, on our own time. We're not, trying to schedule this sort of production with anybody else. It makes sense. And technological advances have increased really everybody's productivity. So these technological advances do come in the form of capital. So, I mean, a vacuum cleaner, far more efficient, far better technology than a broom. A washing machine, far better technology than washing by hand on one of those like washing board things, right? I know you've all seen them. All of that is such good technology that you and I can perform pretty efficient household production quickly, easily, without thinking much about it, okay? All right, so now we've covered households, we've covered firms, and now we're gonna go on to that third, which falls in that second tier with firms, right? Decision maker, which is the government. What is the role of the government? Well, depending on the class you're in, this will have a slightly different answer. And I'm talking about besides econ. But the economic answer is to intervene in the case of market failure. So to get involved in markets that would yield socially undesirable results if the government didn't get involved. So market failure occurs. By definition, market failure it occurs when unregulated markets that the government hasn't intervened in, would yield socially undesirable results. What markets would actually experience market failure if the government didn't get involved? What are some good examples? Remember, I can't see the chat box for whatever reason. Go ahead.
Food production.
Food production, that's a great example, right? We actually do want somebody overseeing food production, food safety, food regulation. Absolutely. What else? Any other thoughts? There should be 1,000 examples.
Antibiotics.
Thank you. Yeah. So the Food and Drug Administration covers both of those, right? It covers food and food production. And then we want our drugs to be tested. We want them to have certain safety standards before you and I get.
Would the FDIC fall under that?
Absolutely. So the FDIC that helps insure banks and things like that. Right, exactly. Yep. We want our banking system regulated. We actually probably don't do it as well as we should, but we do want it regulated. You wouldn't use it if it wasn't, right? Honestly, we could just come up with example after example here. It could be national security, right? It could be education. It could be, anything related to the environment. So there's a reason that the government does what it does. Does it always do it effectively and efficiently? Perhaps not, but that's not for this class, right? All right, so let's break down, we know what the role of government is. We already said it on the last slide, intervene in the case of market failure. Now we're gonna break down that intervention into specific line items that we can discuss. These are the different ways that they would intervene in the case of market failure. So the first one, establish rules of the game. We talked about rules of the game. That's the rules, laws, regulations that businesses have to abide by if they're going to produce here in the US. The second is to promote competition. What do I mean by promote competition?
Antitrust laws.
Good, antitrust laws. So here we're talking about making sure that monopolies, right, don't form, making sure that our markets here in the US remain competitive. Why is competition desirable? Well, you and I get more of everything at a lower price when there's competition in a market. We don't get price gouged. We get the things that we need, okay? This next one, you are gonna wanna write something down. So make sure you have something to write with. We also have monopolies that are totally different than the monopolies that would be addressed through antitrust laws and broken up because of those laws and the government trying to promote competition. We have a separate category of monopolies, and they're called natural monopolies. They're really different than the other monopolies that we'll talk about. We have an entire chapter on monopolies. Natural monopolies are monopolies that exist because they have to. It's the only way that market can operate. It's actually the most efficient way for that market to operate. And let me give you some examples. Really, utility companies are mostly natural monopolies. Let's think about that. Here in Flag, specifically, we have one water company, one natural gas company, one electric company. Are they monopolies in those markets? Yes, they are monopolies in those markets. Well, what's natural about that? Well, why is there only one? There's only one because there's only enough profit for one. We're just not a big enough market for two electric companies or two gas companies or two water companies. If you think about how expensive it is to lay all the infrastructure, the processing plants or generation plants, all of the wires or the pipes, depending on the type of utility. By the time you run all of that, it's actually really hard to make a profit in those industries. And so another one just can't come along and like swoop in. It's not that kind of a market. And so instead of trying to break up the water company, the gas company, the electric company here in Flag, the government does something different. They regulate. And when I say regulate, they keep the prices low enough in that there's actually a price cap in those markets. And that price cap is the regulation. I mean, there's other types of regulation. But when we talk about the monopoly piece of it, the competition piece of it, the government allows those monopolies to earn a profit because that's how we keep them in business. And we need a water company, a gas company, but it limits the amount of profit. Doesn't allow them to charge whatever they want for water, gas, etc., because that would yield a socially undesirable result. So make sure you understand that the government does not break up natural monopolies. They regulate them. They're a good thing. Natural monopolies are a good thing. They're very different than a regular monopoly, okay? Again, we'll cover this more later, but I just have a feeling there's an exam question. They provide public goods. Public goods are things the government provides. These can be services too. I probably should have put provide public goods and services. Sorry, there's a huge truck outside my house. Provide public goods and services. Here we're talking about things like roads, national security, national parks. Those kinds of things are public goods. They're things that are maintained really for all of our benefit. The other thing they do is deal with externalities. An externality, by definition, is the impact on a third party of a two-party transaction. So it's basically a third uninvolved party has to deal with the result of some other transaction that they weren't involved in. A lot of times when we talk about this in econ, we talk about the environment. It's not always environmental. But from a business standpoint, a lot of the externalities that the government has to deal with in business, in firms, in markets, has to do with environmental externalities. So here we're talking about noise pollution, water pollution, air pollution. You and I could be subjected to those things, even if we don't produce those goods or consume those goods that are then generating that negative externality that is the pollution. Negative externalities happen all the time in our daily lives. Your neighbor fills their front yard with trash. right? That's a negative externality. You have to smell it, brings down property values, whatever, right? When I was in college, the guys in the apartment above me used to play basketball all night long. Definitely a negative externality, right? We do have positive externalities, and the government deals with those too. And one of the examples that we use for positive externality is usually education. It benefits me personally, and as all of us as a society, if we educate children, because they're more productive, right? Productivity is a good thing in a society. They commit less crimes. They usually use less government resource. So there's all of these really beautiful things about education that provides positive externalities, and the government hopefully recognizes that education's valuable and diverts resources that way. We know that that doesn't always happen, but it's the government's job to deal with externalities, especially in a business environment. But if you think about, your local police or fire department, folks like that should theoretically be helping deal with externalities too. And they're a branch of the government, right? Or government entity or bureau. The next one is going to be a more equal distribution of income. So here in the US, we do have very large income disparities between the rich and the poor. And actually that gets sort of bigger or wider or more obvious with every passing year. And the government, and we talked about this, right, with those cash transfers, it is part of the government's role to try and redistribute some of that income, theoretically take more from the rich who can afford it, who won't feel it as much, and give it to those people with few resources, who need it, who are going to spend it, who actually use it to stimulate the economy. And an interesting thing happens when people have a lot of money. I've read lots of studies on it, and there's some really interesting things that you may not have thought of, is that every person really only eats 3 meals a day. Yeah, you can spend more on those meals if you have more money, but that's really all you're eating. You really don't eat a lot more than that. And there just comes a point where people who have a lot of money almost have too much to spend, right? They have everything they want, and they just have like idle money that doesn't necessarily stimulate the economy. People who don't have those huge reserves use every penny to stimulate the economy. So it's actually pretty beneficial, this redistribution of income to an extent, right? It's beneficial for everyone. And then this last one is very macroeconomic, takes us back to that PPF, right? Utilizing resources, promoting economic growth, and keeping prices stable, keeping inflation or deflation from happening at a level that is harmful or not sustainable. So let's look at the government structure real quick. For those of you who are educated in this country, this is stuff you've already seen, right? This was in high school government class, probably middle school social studies class. This is something you've seen 10 times, right? But this is the basic breakdown of how the different levels of government are sort of given those roles, the roles that have been given to those 3 different levels of government in terms of trying to keep as many of those markets from experiencing failure as possible, right? So we've distributed them to different branches, different levels of government. So we have the federal government, right? They provide the big things: national security, economic stability, and market competition, things we already talked about, right? State government is more responsible on the education front for higher education, specifically in colleges, things like prisons, highway maintenance, and social welfare in terms of like a lot of welfare systems are state determined and state run welfare systems. And then the local government oversees things like elementary schools and high schools, police, fire, emergency services, and things like that. So all of those roles have been broken down, right? Make it a little bit, to make it makes more sense this way, right? For local governments to be involved in more local decision making. We like it that way, right? So here is a little bit of a discussion on government revenues. So the government, besides borrowing money, we know they borrow a lot of money, they do bring in money too. Not enough, but some. And so some of the biggest pools of money, the biggest by far is taxes, but some of the biggest pools of money in terms of government revenue are taxes, user charges, and monopolies. So taxes by far the largest. You can see that we've broken it down by types of tax and where those taxes flow in terms of which level of government they would flow to sustain what types of government activities. So for example, individual income tax, so we're talking about your federal tax that you pay, would then go to support those things that the federal government's doing, right? That's obvious. States get most of their income from state income tax. Some states don't have income tax. They collect enough revenue other ways that they don't. Nevada, for example, doesn't collect state income tax because they're getting so much of that, you know, gambling revenue that it's not necessary. They just simply don't need the money. But most states do. Most states have an income tax, and your sales tax is going to go to your state. And that's going to help to fund things like higher ed, welfare systems, things like that. And then property tax is really the primary way that we collect tax for the local government system. So if you own property, you are burdened, if you will, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but you are burdened with really a bulk of the taxes for local governments. Second pool is going to be user charges. Here we're talking about things like tolls on toll roads. We don't have really, I don't know if we have any here in Arizona, but a toll road where you have to, you know, pay if you use the road. If you don't use the road, obviously you don't have to pay the user charge, but it's a way to make the people who actually use those goods, those public goods and services, pay for them. Another example here would be that 25 bucks or whatever that you pay to get into the Grand Canyon National Park or any national park. Yeah, usually have to pay a fee, right? And so that really makes the users of those goods responsible for supporting them. And we call those user charges. Then the third is going to be actual monopolies that the government runs. There is a government monopoly that has been in the news a lot lately. Can anyone think of that government monopoly? You may not have thought about it this way.
Is it the post office?
It is the post office. Yeah. I don't know if you know this, but nobody else is legally allowed to put anything into your mailbox. It is actually property of the US government. So I know people do, and I've never heard of anybody being arrested for it, although I'm sure it's happened. But the government has monopolized our mail system. Yeah, we have FedEx. Yeah, we have UPS that deliver packages and envelopes, but at a much higher charge, and someone actually physically has to get out of the vehicle, right? This takes time and energy, and come up and deliver it to your door, where a mail person has the right, because it's monopolized, to put a box in front of your house and use it, drive up to, and deliver mail. I mean, it's a monopoly, but it's actually, and I know there's some debate about this, but it's pretty cheap, and we probably do underpay for the services of the US Postal Service. But it does provide a service to a lot of people. I know a lot of us have technology, but many people don't have technology, and the only way that they get information distributed is still through the US Postal Service. So it's important to a certain demographic of this country, but it is a monopoly. The second monopoly I can think of is lotteries, like state lotteries. You and I are not allowed to do that. You and I are not allowed to hold lotteries. It's actually illegal for us to do it for a few different reasons, right? But one of the reasons is because the state wants to monopolize it and keep it for themselves. A lot of state revenue is generated through local lotteries. So those are really the two big ones that I can think of. I know there's more. Any questions about anything we've gone over so far? I know I'm talking really fast. Good? Okay. All right, so these next two can be kind of confusing. These next two slides. This first one is on something we call tax principles. So these are kind of tax theories, if you will, that we use to determine who should pay tax. And those tax principles really come in two basic forms. And that's, we either make people pay if they have the ability to pay, or we make people pay if they receive the benefit from that public good or service. Now, the first one's much more common because it really is how we collect most of the tax revenue here in the US. And that is the ability to pay tax principle. And this tax principle says that people who can afford it should pay more tax, period, to support public goods and services. And this holds true in a big way in our personal income tax. The more money you make, the higher percentage of your income you pay in taxes. And if you own property, chances are, right, you're paying property taxes, and that's going to be a huge, probably the most important source of revenue for a local government. And it's usually people who have money that own property. And so it's sort of intuitive, but it's how we collect most tax revenue here in this country. Now, those fees at the gate of the national park, or those toll fees on roads or bridges or things like that, those are also considered a tax of sorts. And so when we think about the benefits received tax principle, that's really how we would apply that principle, or that's where we've applied that principle, is on those two particular examples, because you really only have to pay if you go to the Grand Canyon. People who don't go to the Grand Canyon don't have to pay that extra tax, if you will. I know we sort of separate it into user fees, but it is a tax. And if you don't take those roads, you don't have to pay the fees, right? And a lot of times you have a choice when it comes to toll roads. You can choose the nice new fancy road where you have to pay, $1.50, or you can use the old, less efficient 2-lane, much slower road. You don't have to pay anything. So a lot of times people aren't forced onto a toll road. You actually have options, right? And if you choose to take that nice new road, you receive the benefit of it, and you should then be the one who has to pay for it. So a lot of times, especially in states where there's budgeting problems, it's how they physically pay for that road. They borrow money through issuing public bonds. So they borrow money from the public in order to put in that road, and the way they pay it back is through these user charges, and it's the only way it could exist, okay? But if you receive the benefit, you should have to be the one to pay for it. It's just two ways to apply taxation. All right, and now let's talk about something called tax incidence. It's really a continuation of the earlier discussion, okay? First, we gotta decide what is our tax principle, how are we going to apply taxes, and then tax incidence is who bears the burden, which is really what the previous slide was about too, right? but there's two of those. And then the tax incidence, how we decide who's going to bear the burden. If we decide to tax personal income, which we do here in the US, but if a country decides to tax personal income, how you would do it. You have choices on how you would distribute those tax incidents. So the first way is through proportional taxation, which is a flat tax, which means everybody pays the same percentage. So our personal income tax system is not proportional. We don't have a flat tax, right? But the one flat tax we do have that we apply here in this country is sales tax. The rich don't pay a higher sales tax percentage. Yeah, they might buy more and pay more in sales tax, but our percentages are the same. So somebody who has $10 in their bank account and somebody who has $10 million in their bank account still pay the same percentage in sales tax. That would be considered a flat tax or a proportional tax. Now, this middle one is probably the most important because it's how we generate most tax revenue here in this country, and that's through income taxation. And the way that we apply our income tax incidence here in this country is through progressive taxation. Progressive taxation, or the marginal tax rate, it's another word for it, is the more money you make, the higher the percentage you pay in taxes. Therefore, theoretically, people who make more money should be paying more taxes. Not just more because we're all paying 20%. More in that the more you make, the higher your percentage. Some people pay 0% in taxes. Some people pay 10%. The people who make the most should theoretically get the highest percentage of income tax. Okay? Yeah, there's a lot of fancy accountants out there, and that really doesn't happen the way that it was intended to happen. But that's probably the most important one of these three. The third one is something we call regressive taxation, which means the more money you make, the less percentage you pay in tax. It's very hard to come up with a good example here, right? Except unemployment is kind of a good example because you pay unemployment tax or buy unemployment insurance out of your paycheck. Well, you hit a certain threshold, and I can't remember exactly what it is. I want to say it's 60,000, but I'm not sure, where the government's actually not going to insure your income any higher. And so there's no reason for you to be charged higher unemployment taxes above and beyond that, because the government's not actually going to insure that when it comes to unemployment. It's not like you can get unemployment to replace a $250,000 a year salary. It's just not going to happen. The government's not willing to do that. And so as you make more and more money, what you're paying in unemployment does become a smaller and smaller percentage of your income. I don't know. It's the best example we can come up with. The most important thing on this page, don't overthink it, is going to be progressive taxation. All right, and then this takes us to the last slide. So this is the last economic decision maker in that second tier, okay? So because of international trade, because of comparative advantage, the fact that we specialize in trade and then have created a global system for trade, they are a huge economic factor, a huge economic decision maker in our economy. Yeah, not as big as households, not as big as our own government, but really here in the US, we import far more goods than we export, and we consume a larger percentage of the world's goods really than almost any other population. We're top 5 for sure. And so very important when it comes to economic decision making, this international trade relationship that we have, the trade relationships other countries decide to have with us, incredibly important. And we know that we typically gain from that. Everyone typically gains from that. Yeah, there could be some random individual who doesn't necessarily gain from international trade, but as a whole, right? As a consumer, we get more of everything at a lower price, and that's really our gain from this comparative advantage global economic analysis that we would do when we decide that they're a pretty big economic decision maker. One thing that we're just going to talk about briefly that we will cover again in the last chapter of the semester is trade restrictions. This is a highly political discussion, trade restrictions, restricting trade with other countries. We do it all the time. There are very few legitimate reasons why, from an economic perspective, we should restrict trade with other countries. We do it all the time now. You actually pay a higher price for most goods than you should, and you get less than you should because the US government has imposed trade restrictions. Again, we'll get to that. There's a lot of different theories. Politicians throw around a lot of different reasons why they're a good thing. But when you look at it from a strictly economic perspective, there's not a lot of good to be found in trade restrictions. There's a little bit. And again, we'll cover that later. But that really kind of gives you a more in-depth look at the big economic decision makers that we have in our economy. That is all